Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about the number one reason you need to take fish oil. And when it comes to fish oil, most people have no idea where they stand in regards to omega-3s. And yet a deficiency, a lack, can cause premature symptoms like brain shrinking. It can cause loss of memory. It can cause premature cognitive decline. And it is incredibly common. The vast majority of people do not get anywhere near the amount of omega-3s that they need to function the way they're supposed to. But the key to remember here is that the brain decline, the degeneration, starts decades before you ever get any symptoms. So don't wait for the symptoms to start. Be proactive and learn how this works and figure out what you need to do so that you never get onto that premature degeneration. And one of the primary things that destroy the brain is inflammation, the chronic low-grade systemic inflammation that is everywhere in the body, and therefore it is also in the brain, causing neuroinflammation. And at the root of this, of course, is our modern diets with processed foods with high sugar and high omega-6 fatty acids in the commercial vegetable oils that they are recommending for us, and an insufficient intake of omega-3 fats. But what if there was a test where you could measure this very simply and straightforward? And what if after that there was a simple way that you could start doing some things, to take some supplements, to change your lifestyle, and you could fix it so you never get that premature degeneration? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this video so that it is totally clear how that works. So the brain is about 60% fat. It's mostly fat. And some of the primary building blocks are called EPA and DHA. Those are the two fatty acids, the two kinds of omega-3 that we get primarily from fish oil. Our bodies can make a small amount of it by converting some plant fats, but the conversion is very poor and basically nobody gets enough that way. And a big reason that our brains decline is that most people are way too low on omega-3s. They're getting half or less of what they should, but then they're also getting 10 times what they should on omega-6s. And then there's something called palmitic acid that we'll talk later on in some detail. And this is a fatty acid that builds up, that's also in the cell membrane, that creates some problems like inflammation, insulin resistance, and metabolic disease. But then these three conditions, they kind of feed back and create more problems in that the palmitic acid builds up even more. So it becomes a vicious cycle that we have to understand how to get out of. So what do these omega-3 fatty acids do in the body and in the brain? Well, EPA, that stands for eicosapentaenoic acid, and penta means that it's unsaturated in 5 places. So this is a very large, very long fatty acid, and it's very squiggly because it has bends in 5 places. And it helps the body reduce inflammation and therefore also reduces brain inflammation. And in doing that, it reduces the risk of dementia and it reduces the occurrence of depression. And EPA also helps support stable mood and mental clarity. The other one is called DHA, which stands for docosahexaenoic acid. And the hexa means it's unsaturated and bent in 6 different places. So it's a little more bent and it's a little bit bigger even than the EPA. And the DHA is the primary building block of the brain. It's the most important component of building brain tissue. And therefore it's the most important part of the cell membranes of every cell in the body, but primarily the brain cells. And therefore it's critically involved with cognitive and executive function. And when we have enough, we're going to see a dramatic decrease in memory loss and neurodegeneration. And this DHA also stimulates the production of BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a hormone that stimulates the growth of brain cells, but primarily the growth of synapses, which is the connections between brain cells. And the more connections you have, the easier it is for you to learn and adapt, and also for these brain cells to become strong and stable. So why do we want to measure these things? Well, a lot of people, they get their cholesterol test, they get their blood test, they get their blood sugar tests, but virtually no one has ever measured their fatty acids in cell membranes, and yet they're so critically important for your brain health and your overall health. But most people just have to assume where they're standing. They assume that because of certain things they're doing, they might have enough. Like, I eat fish sometimes, and some people don't eat fish at all, but some people do. Like, I love fish, I love sardines. I have a huge stack in the pantry, but sometimes I eat 4 or 5 cans in a week, and sometimes I miss 3, 4, 5 weeks. I just forget. And I think a lot of people are like that even if we eat fish, we probably don't eat it as much as we think we do. And some people say, well, I'm okay, I take a fish oil supplement. But can you actually tell how much is in your fish oil supplement? And do you know how much you're actually supposed to get? Well, most people don't. And even if they have a good supplement, then how often do you remember to take it? So there are many good reasons to actually measure and find out, because once you know, now you know where you stand, you have a baseline, you know how much it's going to take to get to where you want to go, and then you can get the results that you're looking for. So when we measure, the first thing that we want to find out is the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, also called the inflammatory index. And if we have a high ratio, meaning a lot more omega-6 than omega-3 in the cell membrane, now that indicates chronic inflammation. It indicates a decreased neuroplasticity, meaning the brain has a harder time to rewire, and therefore it has a harder time to adapt. A high ratio is also going to increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and the rate of cognitive decline. So when you get your results back, you're going to get a number. And if it's anywhere from 1 to 1, meaning you have equal amounts of omega-6 and omega-3, to a 4 to 1, meaning you have 4 times as much omega-6 as omega-3, now you're still going to be optimal. Lower is typically better, but 4 to 1 is not a problem. However, as this number starts going up, now that indicates more and more inflammation. So if you're at 8 to 1, you're at moderate risk, and if you're over 10, now you're at high risk. Well, believe it or not, many people today are at 20 or 25 to 1, 25 times as much omega-6, which is pro-inflammatory, than the omega-3. And one interesting thing I find is that grass-fed beef actually falls right in the optimal zone. You get about a 2 to 1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 if you eat grass-fed. And if you eat grain-fed, now that's going to fall right in the red zone over here, about 15 to 1. And I'm not mentioning this to suggest that eating grass-fed or grain-fed would be the primary or the only thing that you need to do to fix this, but it's more to illustrate that cows are just like us in that regard, that they react to the stuff that we feed them. And if we feed them grain, if we feed grain to an animal that's supposed to eat grass, then it gets very sick. It gets very inflamed, just like we do when we eat things we're not supposed to. And if we feed it grass, now it's going to end up in the perfect range, just like we will. The next thing we want to know is called the omega-3 index, and that is how much omega-3s are in the cell membrane. If we add up the EPA and the DHA as a percentage of all the fat in that cell membrane, how much of it is omega-3s? And if we have low levels, that's going to increase the risk of slow nerve transmission. it's going to increase the risk of poor communication between brain cells. And how important is that? Well, the brain, as you hopefully know, controls everything in the body. There are trillions of impulses every day. There's billions of impulses every second to regulate and fine-tune this incredible machine that we have. So if we don't communicate well between cells, that affects everything, even your ability to enjoy life. Low levels of omega-3 is also going to increase the speed of cognitive decline. And just as an illustration of how important these fatty acids are, in your brain, there's something called gray matter. That's your cortex. That's the folded thing that looks like a walnut, and that's where all the processing happens in your brain. In the gray matter, you have 30 to 40% DHA, not just omega-3s, because there's even more than that if you add in the EPA, but the DHA alone is 30 to 40%, about a third of the entire active portion of the brain consists of this DHA that we need to get from the diet. And the brain is very special. It has a lot more DHA than the rest of the body, but your average cell membrane is going to have about 10 to 11%. So when we measure this test, we measure it from red blood cells because they are representative. They kind of average what the rest of the body is doing. And if you're at 10 to 11%, that's optimal. You're doing really well. If you are at 8%, they call that sufficient. You're okay, but there's room for improvement. But if you're less than that, then that's insufficient. And if you're under 4%, then you are deficient. Now you've got some real problems going on with that cell membrane. And most people are going to find themselves in the insufficient area, which is between 4 and 8%. Next, we want to know about the trans fat index, which is simply how many percent of trans fats are in our cell membranes. And I can't say enough bad things about trans fats. It is a man-made product. It's a synthetic molecule. It is unnatural. It does not get recognized by your body. We do not have the enzymes to properly break it down. So when it infiltrates your cell membranes, it takes a long time to get rid of. And trans fats will disrupt signaling in your brain. They'll compete for space with the omega-3s and they'll displace them. And like I said, you can't break them down properly. So once they're in those cell membranes, it takes a long time to get rid of them. And furthermore, they cause a few things like inflammation, they cause oxidative stress, they cause insulin resistance, fatty liver, they dysregulate your entire immune system and contribute to autoimmunity. They damage your blood-brain barrier that's supposed to protect your brain from external toxins. They cause depression, they cause cognitive decline, they cause dementia, and even things like heart disease and cancer are caused or contributed to by trans fats, and they are two of our biggest killers overall. And while there are natural levels of a lot of different substances, this is not one of them. So the ideal number here is 0. And we are doing pretty well if we can stay below 0.5. But once we get up to between 1 and 2, now we're at moderate risk, and anything above 2 is high risk. And the main thing about trans fats is just to avoid them. And they've been banned in a lot of places, but for some reason, they're still prevalent and you can find them in a lot of products in a lot of restaurants. So if you buy a product, then make sure that you don't fall for their sneaky little trick where it says trans fat free per serving. That is idiotic because it's either trans fat free or it isn't. And the way that you know is if they call it trans fat free per serving, then if it has less than half a gram per serving, they're allowed to round it to 0. So what you got to do to sneak around that little lie is you read the fine print And if it has anything to do with partially hydrogenated soybean oil, vegetable oil, anything partially hydrogenated, means that there are trans fats in there. There's probably less than half a gram, but like we talked about, it is an unnatural substance and you're supposed to have zero. Even very small amounts create damage. And next we want to understand the palmitic acid index. And palmitic acid is a saturated fatty acid. And now a lot of people are going to go, oh my God, I knew it. You're not supposed to eat saturated fat. Well, this problem has not anything really to do with the consumption of saturated fat. So there are two types of fatty acids, of saturated fat in the body, whether it's in human body or in a cow's body in the meat that we consume. There's stearic acid and palmitic acid. And in tallow, for example, which is close to 100% fat, there's about 20% stearic acid and about 25% palmitic acid. Now, the only difference between these two is that the stearic acid has 18 carbons and the palmitic acid has 16. But that little difference makes a big difference because these are processed differently in the body. We have no problem with stearic acid. We can break it down for energy, or we can convert it into oleic acid. We can take a saturated fat and unsaturated it. So we basically turn it into olive oil. We have an enzyme that can put a double bond and can put a kink, put a little bend in the molecule so it becomes essentially olive oil. But palmitic acid is different. We can't unsaturate that. And when we have high levels, when excess levels build up in the body and in the cell membranes, now we get all kinds of problems. So there's an association between high palmitic levels and high inflammation, with metabolic dysfunction, and with cellular rigidity, meaning that the cell membranes get too stiff to function and signal properly. But if you watched some of my videos before, you know that every time you see associated with, a red flag should go up. That it doesn't mean that palmitic acid causes these things necessarily. It might be, but it could also be that these things cause high levels of palmitic acid. Now, here's how it works. That increased inflammation, high levels of inflammation, prevent us from breaking it down properly, so then the levels build up and get incorporated into that cell membrane. Also, metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, is going to prevent us. It's going to make it more difficult for us to break it down, so the levels build up. But then, of course, if we get very high levels of palmitic acid, of stiff molecules in the cell membrane, now that cellular membrane is going to get rigid and stiff. So now the arrow, the causation arrow, goes the other way. But with this particular situation, that once we have inflammation, once we have metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance, once we have a stiff membrane, now all of these factors further prevent the breakdown. So now it becomes a vicious cycle, and this just keeps spinning out of control. And again, this is why the things that we talk about, the insulin resistance and the low-grade chronic inflammation, is basically associated with all chronic health problems we have. So the factors that interfere with the breakdown of palmitic acid is that when people are insulin resistant, when they have type 2 diabetes, when they have consumption, when they eat a whole lot of omega-6s and not so much omega-3s, then the omega-6s and the high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, both of those are going to prevent the body from breaking down. People that have these don't break down palmitic acid very well. And then, of course, we have our usual suspects, the excess sugar and carbs. What happens to them? Well, first of all, they create insulin resistance, which prevents the breakdown. But then the excess carbs also get converted in the liver. The liver performs what's called de novo lipogenesis, meaning it makes fat from carbohydrates. So the excess sugar and carbs, the body turns them into palmitic acid. So excess sugar and carbs is really the core issue even here. It's not just with insulin resistance, it's also with the fatty acids in your brain. So a lot of people, once they hear saturated fat, they automatically think that, okay, I can't eat that anymore. But a healthy person, someone who is insulin sensitive and metabolically healthy, they have no problem breaking down this palmitic acid. And they have also shown in studies that a low carb, high fat diet or ketogenic diet will lower the amount of palmitic acid. So the palmitic acid index really just becomes a marker for insulin resistance and metabolic disease. But unlike the trans fats, where the ideal level is 0, palmitic acid is something natural, so we're really never going to get below 15% because there is a normal amount in there. So optimal would be about 15 to 20%. Moderate would be between 20 and 25, and 30 and up or 25 and up would be a high risk, would be a high indicator of metabolic disease. So now if we measure these markers and we understand, we get a baseline, now we can take timely action. We can take action and change things before it becomes a bigger problem. And the things that we want to do is to reduce sugar, reduce refined carbs, reduce processed foods, reduce the commercial seed oils and vegetable oils, and everything that has excess omega-6s. So for some people, you might even want to look at how much nuts you eat. Even if nuts are healthy in general, there are a lot of them that are high in omega-6s. So it's okay to eat a little bit, but don't make the nuts a foundation for your entire diet. And you want to increase your consumption of fish and or your intake of fish oil supplements. And if you are a fisherman, or if you eat fish, you live by the coast and you have access to excellent fish every single day, then you're probably okay without supplements. But if not, then you might want to take a look at some supplements. And if you measure now, then you would know, because maybe you're not eating the right kind of fish, or maybe you're not absorbing it, or maybe your supplement doesn't have enough. That's the whole point of measuring. And the best test, in my opinion, is called brain span. And the reason I think that is that it has 2 parts. Not only does it measure the blood markers, but it also has a cognitive test. So when you register, you get to go online and you take this cognitive test. So you get a baseline for your brain's capacity to perform certain tasks like short-term memory and processing speed and attention, cognitive flexibility, and your executive function. So you get a baseline and then you can retest it later and see if you have improved. And the second part is a mail-in test. You get a little kit, you take 1 drop of blood and you mail it into them, and that's going to cover all of the markers that we discussed in this video. And then shortly thereafter you get a report. It's a very detailed report, has a lot of good information, and it has a lot of recommendations, not just about supplements, but also lifestyle changes that would be a good idea. And then just about how much of the different EPA and the DHA in milligrams that you would need to reach your goals. And then of course the whole idea with a test and a baseline is that after 3 to 4 months you test again, and you test both the cognitive and the blood spots so that you can see if you have improved. And typically you're going to see probably between a 50 to 80% improvement in the blood values. And as far as the cognitive, most people will see a significant improvement, and a lot of times as much as 30% improvement in 3 to 6 months. And if you have additional questions, you can also talk to one of my associates and get a little consultation. And this would be primarily to figure out which supplements would provide specific ratios and amounts of EPA and DHA that you would need to reach your goals. And normally this test runs $199, that's the list price. But if you order right now and you use the link that I'm going to post down below here, we're going to get it to you for $179. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.